dust and the filth, all the wires and the cables that you see hanging from the different electric poles. It's a big, visible urban mess. Many of you might have tried to access government services in the last few weeks or months. It's almost impossible to get anything done without pulling strings, utilizing your connections, or even paying a small bribe. The air we breathe, the water that we drink, the vegetables that we buy on the streets and eat, is lightly contaminated. So there's a lot of anger around these issues. And in more recent weeks, the lack of safety around our girls and women has become a very prominent issue. 2017, I think about 1,500 girls were raped, which were actually reported, which is double the number that was reported the year before. So there's a sense of frustration on the way things are happening, and a prevailing mood of what sociologists call anomie, this gradual breakdown of social norms, orderly behavior, and the failure of the society to guide moral precepts in society. So that's the daily sort of mood that we come across these days. But you step back 25 years from today. Let's go back to 1991, 91, 92, after the restoration of multi-party democracy. Poverty in Nepal has declined at a dramatic pace. It's probably, we've heard about how China has made dramatic progress on poverty reduction, but Nepal's pace of reduction is as spectacular. If you take the latest measure of international poverty line that measures extreme poverty, which is $90 in purchasing power parity terms at 2011 prices, poverty in Nepal declined from about 46% to less than 15% between 1996 and 2011. We haven't done a more recent living standard survey. If you extrapolate the trends that we witnessed during that period, which actually coincided with the armed conflict, one can say that the level of extreme poverty in Nepal is really possibly within single digits. The national poverty measure, which is a slightly different variation on the international measure, we take a consumption-centric approach. That also is quite good. It's less than 20% now. Again, you extrapolate, it's doing very well. Yet, you square that with the earlier vignette that I presented on the daily frustrations, right? So how do you reconcile this? When you compare Nepal with itself 25 years ago, we've done fantastic, and I'm actually not talking about the political mayhem that we also witnessed during the same period. 10 years of Maoist civil war, another 10 years of protracted transition and political instability. Yet, coinciding with this fantastic social development achievements, that the world has recognized and has been, rewarding us with. So my hypothesis is that all the things that I said at the beginning is actually true. People feel that. All the things that I said about the official statistics is also true. These things are quite rigorous, credible, they're internationally verifiable and all that. So I think, this paradox of things have become very well, we've done a lot, yet people are still unhappy, is really the relative story that needs to be told. So relative to Nepal's own performance in 1990 or in the early 90s, we've done well. But it's the prevailing sense that relative to Nepal's own potentials, the perceived potentials, we're lagging behind because of the way we've organized our polity, because of our quality of governance and all that. And even more compelling is relative to peer countries who are like us 25 years ago or 35 years ago, we've really lagged behind. Right? So this story is one of a country, despite immense potentials, has lagged behind its true potentials, and other countries have really leapt ahead. Right? So this is the story, I think, in Nepal's development that needs to be told. So where did we begin from? What were the factors that held us back? And looking ahead, is there room for optimism? Are there things that we can take control of to really steer a new course for Nepal's development so that all the aspirations, especially the younger folk, sort of carry, can be realized? So that's really the background to this short presentation. I want to take you back not 25 years, but 250 years. Now, the richest and the most dynamic and the most powerful economy that we have today is the United States. It also started its modern journey in 1775. We know it declared independence in 1776, but George Washington was declared the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army in 1775. So we can say the United States and Nepal started our modern journeys together around the same time period. The third important fact, which is particularly relevant to economists, is the first rigorous and systematic study of how countries prosper and why some countries lag behind. In other words, the wealth and poverty of nations was actually written in 1775. The mass circulation began again in 1776, but this was this Wealth of Nations, the book written by a Scottish economist, philosopher actually, Adam Smith, 1775. So, the modern journeys began there. The academic treatise on how to be developed and what works in economic prosperity also began there. So it's a nice starting point and a confluence of several coincidences. What we see here, and I've taken a few countries here which sort of started the journey around the same time. Nepal's actual data, hard data, is available after 1815, the Sugauli Treaty that we had with after the war with the British. But what is striking about this graph is each of these countries, there has come a critical juncture, a date, which you don't know at the point it is happening, but when you look back in hindsight, there's always a very decisive structural break in the trajectory, the development trajectory of all the countries that have made fantastic progress, but there are also stories of stagnation. So I won't have time to go into detail, but with the United States, for example, the top graph, the top line for the United States, you can sort of see that 1865 was their critical juncture. The end of the Civil War, they enter into this long era of peaceful stability and all that, where and technological breakthroughs are happening. The second phase of the Industrial Revolution is off the ground, and they're actively borrowing and adopting technology that is coming out of Western Europe. So that upward climb that you see is pretty dramatic, very rapid. But the good thing of dealing with data is you do see dips and collapses that we know have history has witnessed. So the first big dip is the Great Depression, right? The second dip is around the Second World War. But the economy is so resilient that quickly regroup and the upward climb continues. The other dramatic progress is of Japan, right? The red line. Again, a big collapse in Second World War, but they continue this process of economic modernization and catch up very fast. The blue line is for South Korea, almost at the level of Nepal and a lot of the lagging African countries, yet the process of catch up is so dramatic that around 2015 they actually catch up with Japan. And then the later countries, the other countries, Malaysia, the green is for China, after Gaige Kaifang, Deng Xiaoping's reforms, late 1970s, it catches up. Even India is becoming much more dynamic with reforms unleashed by Rajiv Gandhi in the late 80s, but a full opening up of the economy in the early 90s under Narasimha Rao. So relative to all these countries, there's one contrasting story of Argentina. The point there is these things actually are not automatic, right? Countries and the leadership, the entrepreneurs, the citizens have to be engaged in this process so that you translate the promise into reality. It's not automatic, and that lesson is really borne out by what Argentina has gone through. At the turn of the 20th century, they were one of the richest countries in the world, but with certain false starts, wrong choices regarding policies and institutional choices, they really lagged behind the United States. So they have continued to stagnate, and now they could have been at American levels, but here you see they're at Malaysian levels, right? So there's a story of stagnation that also plays out over time. Relative to all these, and I've mentioned the critical junctures for all these countries, the story of Nepal, that black line there, it appears is virtually flat. So on a relative scale, if you take this long-term historical perspective, and on the y-axis we have these international dollars, Technically, it's called Giri Khamis international dollars. The nominal US currency figures are adjusted to make them comparable across countries and over time. Nepal's, of course, it has increased, per capita income has increased, but over time, on a large continuum of history, and relative to other countries that have done well, our performance, relatively speaking again, is almost stagnant, flat. So we really haven't grown at all on a relative scale. Politically and socially, as I mentioned earlier, we've done great, fantastic progress. So this is the story of stagnation, economic stagnation that needs to be told. Now the reason why we have lagged behind, now let's compress the history. I don't want to talk about 250 years. Let's look at the scenario after the Second World War, when it's now well documented that about 13 economies did dramatically well. So forget the West, Western Europe, or what we call Western offshoots, which includes the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and all these countries. So forget them. Let's just look at countries that did very well after the Second World War. When sort of the Industrial Revolution matured, we went through all these global upheavals, and some of these countries really got their acts together and did very well. So Nobel laureate Michael Spence has this report called the Growth Commission report, where he singles out 13 economies, not countries, but economies, because some of these economies include Taiwan and others, which have a dubious political jurisdiction. But starting with Japan, so on the x-axis we have between 1965 and 95, this period of growth takeoff. What was the per capita income then of these countries relative to that of the United States, the leading economy of that time? So Japan was doing very well, but still only barely 30% of the US per capita income. And all these other economies, right? So Malaysia, Malta, Hong Kong, Singapore, China, Thailand, Korea, and all these. So 9 of the 13 actually come from Asia. The non-Asian economies include Botswana, Malta, Oman, and Brazil. Brazil has slowed down a little bit, but it really grew quite handsomely between 1950 and 1980. Now, the message of this graph is all the countries that did well, and I also have lots of dots for the other countries that I have not named. One common thread of all these countries is they really invested their way to prosperity. So it's investment, it's gross fixed capital formation that economists call, it's a proxy for investment relative to the size of the economy that really matters. So what is driving at low levels of development is investment, right? So private investment, public investment, when you're in this rut, when you're at this low level of development, you can really pump capital in such numbers, in such quantities, that you can actually graduate from low income to middle income status. That formula won't work when you need to jump from middle income to high income status. That's why you hear notions of middle income trap, for example. Countries like Malaysia, Mahathir and others did very well, quickly pulled the country out of this low income trap, but now they're stuck in this middle income trap. And very few countries, like Republic of Korea, Finland in Europe, for example, Taiwan, have managed to go from middle income to high income, but many are stuck at this level. The point again here is, relative to all the countries that invested around 30 to 40% of their GDP year after year after year, accompanying the spectacular growth rates that they were seeing, Nepal is a classic case of underinvestment. So we're at around 15%, when to see the kind of miracle that we all aspire to, you should have been spending or attracting investment to the tune of 35 to 40% relative to the size of your economy. So this is what we have failed. Now, the third question that comes is, why is that so? So this is the big question, right? If we go out and ask a common layperson, you'll say, why do you think Nepal is not developed? They'll say, our politicians are corrupt, nothing works and all that. That's true, but you have to be careful. In science and social science, you need to be careful in really distinguishing between the symptoms and the structural causes. So I think, if you look at the vast body of work that's been done on the causes of long-term prosperity in development economics, I think we can narrow the hypothesis to two big themes. The first is geography, and by that I mean our peculiar location, a landlocked location, which really has inhibited the degree of interactions that we have with the outside world. And the second one is extractive institutions. The kind of political and economic rules of the game that we have in our country has really not provided the right kind of incentives to save, to invest, to guarantee property rights, for entrepreneurs to grow, for enterprises to flourish, and that really has held us back. Now, there are competing theories on which is more important. I personally think, there's institutions are much more dominant now, because even if you take economies that are comparable geography-wise, but that have experimented with diverse institutions, North and South Korea, East and West Germany, and this book that Waglé and Robinson did on Why Nations Fail, they start with this compelling story of Nogales. Half of Nogales is in the United States, the other half is in Mexico. So, geography-wise, climate-wise, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of the food they eat, in terms of the air and water they breathe, it's identical. The only thing that's different between the two halves of Nogales is the economic and political institutions. So that's a nice scientific way of establishing causality. Otherwise, you tend to confound lots of variables, and it's not often clear what caused what. But in this case, sort of natural experiments, you can kind of point out that it's the quality of inclusive economic and inclusive political institutions that tend to create the kind of incentives that's good for wealth creation. Now, in geography, there's something to be said. What geography did to Nepal, landlockedness, it's costly access to world markets. It restricted the flow of people. It restricted the flow of ideas. It restricted the flow of capital. Now, there's a whole political economic dimension there, of course, which needs to be acknowledged. Maybe because of this isolationist location, we actually managed to keep our sovereignty. That's a different matter, right? But economically speaking, this costly distance to world markets really holds you back. Because if you look at global stories of wealth creation, that's rooted in sustained increases in productivity. Productivity comes from specialization. The degree to which you are able to specialize is shaped by the extent of the market and by the division of labor. Division of labor is shaped by the extent of the market. So the distant you are from proximities of world commerce, a lot of these channels really hold you back. Now, there are exceptions, because the channels that I just mentioned do not apply to those countries. So 6 or 7 economies inside Central Europe, it doesn't apply to them. Many talk about Switzerland in Nepal. Switzerland is technically not even landlocked. You go to a city like Basel, 50% of the Swiss population lives in low elevation cantons. All the ships that come to cities on River Rhine, you can load things there and offload things across the Atlantic in New York. So these are navigable rivers, so they don't have access to sea, but they have navigable rivers. And all the other economies, Austria, and Czech Republic, and others, you are in the center of the world's largest common market. So the traditional channels through which landlockedness penalizes you doesn't apply to them. And there are some non-European exceptions, Kazakhstan, Botswana, very rich in natural resources, well-managed natural resources can sort of negate those traditional conventional channels. So the 9 dominant models of the 19th century and the 20th century of trade, production, exchange, commercial engagements really held us back. But more important than that is, as I argued earlier, extractive institutions, right? You look at the history, the 250 years, until 1816, it's the Shah kings, a lot of turmoil there. Bhimsen Thapa, again, a lot of turmoil. Rana regime, well-known, well-documented in history, 100 plus years. Panchayat, economically slightly loosened up, but politically restricted. So even though our origin goes back to 1775, we really opened up our polity, economically and politically, only around 1990. So there's a lot to be done after this. But is geography destiny? Are we doomed to stagnation? Are we, there's no hope for Nepal to really climb up? And there, I'm an optimist, right? So I do feel, I'm convinced actually, having worked in Nepal for the last 4 years, that best days of Nepal are actually ahead of us. And there are lots of reasons for that. I won't have time to explain them in detail, but let me share with you a few areas where we should really focus on. I think the first thing to do, looking ahead, if we want Nepal to climb to at least Sri Lankan levels of prosperity in the next 10 years in terms of average per capita income, is recognize what are the big shifts that's going on in the Nepali economy and society at this moment. So there's a demographic window still left, still available for Nepal, if we can get our acts together. So a lot of the young people who leave the country in epic numbers today to work in the Gulf and Malaysia, if the economy, domestic economy is going, they will come back or they will be absorbed here. So that demographic window is really important for us to optimize. The second big shift, which is probably a result of this young demography, is the wide migration, the migration phenomenon within Nepal and outside of Nepal. That's a big thing that we need to acknowledge. So this rhetoric of, Nepal is a gaon country, and we need to, Nepal ko vikas is gaon ko vikas, that narrative is changing. 60% of our population are already living in so-called municipalities. So people are coming out of agriculture, but they're not being absorbed in industries. They're jumping to the services sector, but the services sectors, which traditionally used to be high-end, high-value-adding sectors, that's not the case right now. It's petty, low-end kind of services, right? So that trend needs to be internalized. The phenomenon of deep connectivity. So deep connectivity, again, this is another number that reveals a lot. In 1991, the entire country of Nepal had 71,000 phones, right? Now, 30 million. This leapfrogging that we are able to do technology-wise, big thing. Proximity to China and India, the entire global economic center of gravity is shifting. 1980, it was in the middle of the Atlantic. Around 2006, it came to somewhere around east of Helsinki. 2050, it will be right between India and China and probably along the Himalayas. That's a huge plus, right? If we reorient the way we think to this possibility, this tantalizing possibility of riding the wave of Chinese and Indian revival, I think that will be fantastic for us. And the availability of concessional financing to fund large-scale infrastructure, that will also be a big plus. The fifth enabler for us will be the intangible assets that Nepal has. The image, the reputation, the brand that we enjoy, and the traditional, the social capital that Nepal is known for. What are the means? So if the end is sort of generating, sharing, and sustaining prosperity, what are the means to get there, taking advantage of all these enablers? I think greater productivity, of course. So I talk in terms of themes like agriculture, tourism, water, and sanitation, but cross-cutting themes like raising productivity should be our main focus. Formalizing our economy should be another one. Greener urbanization is a big opportunity because in many respects, we really haven't gotten started on this agenda in a systematic way. Fairer social mobility, so this is a package around quality health, education, social protection systems, and effective governments, right? Now, there are risks that we should also anticipate. So the big risks that Nepal will need to factor in going ahead: disasters, slow disasters, and the rapid disasters. So the slow disasters is climate change. It will impact gravely on our agricultural situation, energy situation, and all that, and the quality of life that especially the poor people lead. And the rapid disasters are the ones that we've been witness to in the last 3-4 years: the floods, the earthquakes, the landslides. So the investments that we need to make in pre-disaster infrastructure will be extremely important. There are some risks related to neighborhood effects. The macroeconomic policy choices are constrained. We may invest heavily in the way we connect with the rest of the world, but if contiguous countries don't invest with the same spirit, we are still penalized. So there's a lot of room for regional coordination of shared infrastructure and all that. Human capital depletion will be another risk that will continue to plague us. And I think poor governance at the federal level, at the provincial level, and the local levels will also need to be watched. So let me conclude by saying, if we take this big picture, go back to 1769, and analyze the journey that we've all taken together, take stock of where we stand, take stock of all the possibilities and the enablers and the means, and set realistic goals in sight, I really think, and let me repeat here, best days of Nepal are still ahead. Thank you very much.